On Wednesday, two of the biggest remaining Occupy camps in the country were evicted by police. In Philadelphia, police arrested 52 people during an overnight raid in the city's Dilworth Plaza. Mayor Michael Nadler said the occupiers had to go to make room for a $50 million renovation project. Almost simultaneously, an overnight raid was taking place in Los Angeles. More than 1,400 officers moved into the park surrounding LA City Hall and arrested about 200 people for failing to disperse. You can see in the video, police in white hazardous material suits from the last scene in E.T., which they say they wore for fear of biological infection. Also this week, Occupy Wall Street protesters took a turn that I think is fascinating. They went right after Democrats, targeting fundraisers by both President Obama and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And this new turn may be indicative of what's next for Occupy Wall Street. We have some sound of the protesters outside a fundraiser for the DCCC, Democratic Congressional Campaign. Here is their complaint using the human mic.
The Democratic Party voted to go to war. They also bailed out the banks. And in the healthcare system. That was written by healthcare industry. So if there's any confusion about this movement, we're not Democrats. We're not Republicans. We are the people. And we are pissed off. No more money. In politics.
All right, that's the bill of particulars against your colleagues. You voted for the war and you bailed out the banks.
Well,
I mean, not you personally, Gerald.
First of all, it's factually incorrect, at least as far as voting for the war. Democrats in the House voted 126 to 81 against the war. Against the war in Iraq.
Not in the Senate.
Not in the Senate, but they were talking about the House. House Democrats.
Well, they were at a House fundraiser.
The House Democrats voted 3-2 against going to war, even though the House leadership at the time, the House Democratic leadership, Dick Gephardt, was for it, but most of us voted against it.
When you see these protesters going after a DCCC fundraiser, what's your response? You're someone who I've a great deal of admiration for in both your politics and also your sort of sensibility, and we've had conversations about how broken the campaign finance system is. Don't they have a point? Isn't it crazy that you guys have to go to these hotels and
oh yeah, listen, the campaign finances, to the extent that they were protesting the campaign finance system,
which they were.
They're absolutely correct. I've said many times, as far as I'm concerned, the campaign finance system that we have in this country is a metastasized cancer on American democracy. And if we don't fix it, the Supreme Court's made it worse, but if we don't fix it, at some point, historians will write of the American Republic as they do of the Roman Republic. It was a good 200-year run with democracy, but then it evolved into a plutocracy or an oligarchy or something else, because that's the way it's going. You put any person who wants to run for public office, unless he happens to have a few tens of millions of dollars in his pocket initially, into the position of having to raise huge amounts of funds, and then you say, but don't get into a conflict of interest. It's almost impossible to avoid either the appearance or the reality. Has there been a moment in your career when you butted up against that? You had to look in the mirror? Well, you're always trying to think, or not to think. If I vote this way, who of my contributors and friends will be angry? It's human nature. You can't avoid thinking of that occasionally. You have to try, and you have to try to avoid it. Does everybody succeed in avoiding it all the time? I doubt it. So, I mean, that's a problem.
Well, I want to say, I mean, I think that you said that they were protesting the campaign finance system. I'm not really sure that that is what they're protesting. I think they're protesting...
Well, let me just say, the last line was, we are pissed off, no more money in politics.
Right, but what they're protesting, to a certain extent, is Democrats participating in the kind of events that our current campaign finance system make mandatory. It doesn't... I mean, on the one hand, I understand the symbolic importance. There's something kind of obscene about seeing Democrats raise money from Wall Street fat cats, even as they pretend to be a champion of the 99%. But it would be suicidal for them to opt out of those kind of fundraisers, given the system as it is. And
it would also be naive to think that the campaign financing system does not affect the decisions that Congress makes on both parties.
Right.
I mean, obviously, when you see things like, when we had the legislation, the cram-down legislation, to enable bankruptcy judges to cram down the value of the loan to the value of the house when they seize the house.
Yeah, let me just explain that, right? So what happens right now, just so people are aware of the facts here, because this is very important. If you declare bankruptcy, right, and you have two homes, you have a vacation home and a first home. The vacation home, right, the judge can come in and say to the people you owe money to, we're going to write down the principle of this. You only have to pay back so much, and that's just the way it is.
You only have to pay back the amount of the value of the home.
Exactly. They can't do that on the first home. First homes are protected, and there was legislation to change that because it's a good way of dealing with the fact that we have all this housing.
And you can cram down anything else. If you owe more on the car than the car is worth,
right,
they seize the car, but you don't still owe money on it.
The only two things you can't are student loans and your first mortgage, i.e. the way that most Americans enter.
So there was legislation on Capitol Hill to change this.
We passed it twice in the House. It failed in the Senate, and the day that it failed, Senator Durbin, who was the chief proponent in the Senate, said the banks own this place. And I don't know if they own it, but they have a large interest in it.
Let's talk about who owns Congress more after this break.
So rock me, mama, like a wagon wheel. Rock me, mama, anyway.
We are having the nerdiest arguments during every break. Here at my panel, I got Gerald Nadler, Congressman from New York, Heather McGhee from Demos, Michelle Goldberg from the Daily Beast, and Josh Barro from the Manhattan Institute, who also writes for National Review. So we were talking about Occupy Wall Street going after Democrats, and I wonder, Heather, whether you think this helps the movement or hurts it. I mean, I think there's, it's a very fraught situation, the relationship liberals and progressives and people on the left have to the Democratic Party and Barack Obama. It's something that takes up 90% of my Twitter feed arguments and responses to this show, and when you think about booking guests, and I wonder if there's something alienating to a constituency Occupy Wall Street might want to bring along by showing up and outside a Democratic fundraiser or one of the president's fundraisers.
Right. I think it does two things that are good. First of all, I mean, the power of the Tea Party politically was that it went after Republicans, that it primaried them, that it said that there is actually a core value system that we need to be disciplining our elected officials with. I think that's very important, and it's very important for the 99% movement to do that. Second thing, though, I actually think that the more anything we can do to get what I think is the real sleeper issue in this campaign, which is money in politics and the corruption of our democracy, into the light, it brings in a whole lot of people in the 99% ideologically into a conversation that I feel like actually sounds like it's tantamount to the issues that we're actually facing in our country.
Yeah, let me just address the first thing that you just said, and that is that the Tea Party enforced discipline, so forth. Brought Republicans, threatened to primary Republicans. They did, and they had a tremendous impact. If the Occupy Wall Street movement will say, here are our principles, this is what we want, and we will launch political attacks on Democrats who don't meet them.
And primary them.
And support Democrats who do, they can have a tremendous impact. If they attack Democrats in general, it'll be completely dissipated.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem and one of the big differences between the way that the Tea Party attacked Republicans and the way Occupy Wall Street attacks Democrats is that the Tea Party wanted to take over the Republican Party and has taken over the Republican Party, and that's been kind of the right-wing MO since the start of the religious right. Whereas I think one of the huge tragedies and problems with progressive politics, at least since the 60s, is this tendency to quickly despair of electoral politics in general and to kind of say it just doesn't work. And
the system is screwed.
The system is screwed, and we don't want any part of it. We don't want to sully ourselves, and we're going to somehow kind of fight it by creating some sort of alternative countercultural society. It's so destructive.
When I was a psych major in college, we called this learned helplessness. When you couldn't do something about something, you just said you found a way to avoid actually engaging so that you wouldn't go through the process of fighting and losing. And I think if Occupy Wall Street goes and tries to primary moderate Democrats in Congress, they try to go defeat Heath Shuler in rural North Carolina, they're going to lose. And the reason is that the Republican Party is more ideologically coherent than the Democratic Party, and the Tea Party was right that Republicans were out of step with them. I don't know that Democrats are out of step.
That depends. That depends. Yep. An intelligent political strategy for progressives, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or anybody else, would be to say, okay, maybe he's Schuler, who is very conservative, is in a very conservative district. A more liberal Democrat couldn't win there, so we're not going to deal with that. On the other hand, so-and-so is in a more progressive district, and he's much more conservative than necessary for that district, so we're going to have a primary there.
Can I make a response, though, to this idea? Sure. Because I do think that I understand what you're saying about this sort of learned helplessness and the sort of despairing of electoral politics, but I think also our visions get very narrow very quickly. I mean, let's look at some of the most successful social movements. You know, Gloria Steinem wasn't running, wasn't primarying candidates. Martin Luther King Jr. and SNCC and SCLC and the entirety of the civil rights movement architecture was essentially not involved in electoral politics, which is not to say they weren't meeting at the White House and they weren't pushing for legislation, but their fundamental channel was direct action, was creating was forcing the system to encounter the moral demands of the movement, and the politics followed that. Martin Luther King was not looking at polling.
But they were also engaging with sympathetic politicians.
And making very specific legislative demands.
Yes, right.
At one point. If you were sympathetic to them, if you said, I want to support civil rights, I want to support the women's movement, I want to support this and that proposal, they supported you, they praised you, etc. They didn't just have disdain for the entire system.
But there's also sort of a time lapse here. I mean, I think if you look at, for instance, you know, the sort of culminating legislative battle of the sort of second wave feminist movement in the 1960s was the Equal Rights Amendment, which it's remarkable to think about came so close to being passed into law into the United States Constitution, probably the high watermark for sort of legislative feminism in the country. But that came years after this entire socio-cultural movement had percolated, and people were in book clubs, and people were doing all sorts of stuff that was these sort of cultural manifestations and emanations.
Well, I don't think, right, but I also don't think that, I mean, the point is certainly not that you don't need a kind of a broader social movement or a broader, I think the problem, and you've seen this on the left, is when that social movement, instead of saying we're going to be separate from the Democratic Party is one thing, or separate from electoral politics, saying we want nothing to do with it, that this is so corrupt.
Occupy isn't saying that. They went to the fundraiser. I mean, I think what is different between the Tea Party and Occupy is that, frankly, the Tea Party first of all, was the end of a very long conservative movement, or the sort of pinnacle of a very long conservative movement and conversation. It was stale ideas about the size of government and taxes and all that. And it had the Koch brothers to immediately step in and say, okay, here's some money to run some really great campaigns. Occupy Wall Street is not going to get the same money.
Occupy Wall Street has already accomplished a tremendous great thing for the country. They've already changed the discussion to a great extent from all we were talking about a year ago was the deficit, which frankly is a long-term problem, not an immediate crisis. They have injected into the discussion what politicians like me were not able to inject into the discussion, namely the inequality, the 99% versus the 1%, and saying we got to do something about the unemployed, et cetera. Where they go from here depends ultimately on the tactics they determine to use, and that remains to be seen.
In terms of Occupy Wall Street's success, in terms of framing the debate, I want to play this bit of sound from Frank Luntz, who's of course the GOP sort of wordsmith, mastermind pollster, who's talking about to GOP governors about Occupy Wall Street and what his fears are about it.
I'm so scared of this anti-Wall Street effort. I'm frightened to death. Okay, they should occupy a job and take a bath. I get that joke. But man, they're having an impact on what the American people think of capitalism. And so I'm trying to get that word removed and replace it with either economic freedom or free market. But the public now believes that capitalism, they still prefer capitalism to socialism, but they think that capitalism is immoral. And if we're seen as defenders of, quote, Wall Street, unquote, we got a problem.
Josh, you agree with Frank Luntz that they're making us question the fundamental soundness of capitalism?
Well, he's the one with the poll numbers to look at. I think the economic stagnation that we've been in through the last 3 years has made a lot of people question the market system that I think they felt a lot better about a few years ago. So I think he's probably right about that. The thing that I think maybe Republicans don't need to be as afraid as they might otherwise be is that I think the Occupy movement has succeeded in getting a lot of people's attention and saying things that people are sympathetic to, but if they can't actually translate that into policy items that they hold people accountable for in Washington, and they keep saying abstract things like, well, get the money out of politics, that's a sentiment that basically everyone can agree with. And I think this was the problem with John McCain's 2000 campaign for president, is, he's running on campaign finance reform and everyone says, oh, that's great, but nobody actually goes and votes on that. And so, and I think that, what Republicans really ought to be afraid of would be if the Occupy movement became a lot more like the Tea Party, started really engaging on specific policy items that are on the agenda in Washington. And while I think that they are not likely to be as successful as the Tea Party in holding Democrats to account because of the ideological disperseness of the Democratic coalition, I do think that they really could have a lot more impact that Republicans and Democrats would
I agree with that, but I'll say one other thing. Yeah. There's capitalism and there's capitalism. There's lots of different capitalisms. There's the Chinese model of capitalism at this point, whatever they want to call it. There's the capitalism that we practice in this country from 1945 to 1980, basically, where there was a social compact, where you had lots of union power, where they taught us when I was in school that income went up with productivity, that average income went up with productivity. That stopped being true. Productivity has skyrocketed since 1980, and income is flatlined. Where we created a large middle class and they got the benefits. The last 30 years, all the benefits have gone to the very top. And criticizing the system and saying, let's go to a system more like the 1945 to 1980 system, which is also a capitalist system, but it's a capitalist system that worked for people, is a very valid political objective.
And there's capitalism in Germany, which is now conservative columnist David Brooks' favorite model, which is a capitalism that involves union members sitting on corporate boards, which is a kind of capitalism that we can import.
A capitalism in Germany that was working wonderfully until Merkel got elected, decided on an austerity budget, and is tanking the economy.